please remove those hats. You're in the Pabst Blue Ribbon Gateway Buick GMC Kings Court on 590 The Man.
And we welcome you back in, Kevin Slaten, on a Friday afternoon with you in the Pabst Blue Ribbon Gateway Buick GMC Kings Court on 590 The Man and streaming live at talkstl.com. Download the free app. You can take us with you anywhere you want to go. So many things happening in an October sports calendar every year, and none better to check in with than the busiest man in sports broadcasting, Bob Costas. Bob, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Kevin, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I know you're out in Denver for the Sunday night game, a great one it looks like on paper, the 49ers and the Broncos, though I just noticed that Patrick Willis is out for the game.
Patrick Willis is out, it appears, and obviously, as you said, Niners-Broncos would be a marquee matchup in any case. But here you've got one of the most recognizable and popular athletes of the past generation on the verge of history. If Peyton Manning throws 3 touchdown passes, which is just about his per-game average since he joined the Broncos, then he moves past Brett Favre and becomes the all-time leader in career touchdown passes. So that could be a moment, too. It's
an amazing accomplishment for Peyton Manning, considering where he was just 3 years ago with a future uncertain due to a neck injury. An amazing bounce back as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, an incredible bounce back, no doubt about it. Now, the 2 seasons in Denver have ended in bitter disappointment. The first year, they lost the home playoff game against Baltimore when Flacco threw the seemingly impossible touchdown pass with about a minute to go, and somehow the receiver got behind the secondary, a blown coverage situation. Then they went to overtime, and Peyton threw a pick, and they lose the game when they thought they had a path to the Super Bowl. Then the next year they do get to the Super Bowl, and it's no disgrace to lose the game, but to get blown out the way they did against Seattle. So his tenure in Denver has been tremendous in every respect, except for the way each of the 2 seasons ended.
Is that, if we look into the crystal ball, Bob, is that something eerily similar to John Elway's career in Denver? Many playoff disappointments, Super Bowl disappointments, wonderful numbers, and at the tail end of his career, back-to-back Super Bowl wins.
Boy, they can only hope. He and Elway and all the Bronco fans can only hope. I believe that Elway went to 3 Super Bowls before he won the first of them in upset fashion against the Packers, who were the defending Super Bowl champs at that time. And then they went back the next year, Elway's last year, and they beat Atlanta for back-to-back. If Peyton could get out of town with anything like that, everybody would be thrilled.
Yeah, they'd put a statue of him up instead of that Bronco at the stadium.
Yeah, exactly. The Bronco comes down and just a giant picture of Peyton in mid-pose goes up, yep.
Hey, we haven't had a chance to talk since the NCAA eased sanctions on Penn State. They're allowed to play in bowl games this year. The scholarship numbers are coming back for next season. Even the money that they were fined, $60 million, has been allowed now to stay in the state of Pennsylvania. I give a tip of the hat to you because I know that a lot of what's happened there had to be partially due to your picking up that baton and having some shows that were fair and allowed people to judge freely rather than the free report. And I think the Penn State folks feel the same way.
Well, if they do, then I'm gratified by that. I think that might be giving me a bit too much credit. I think the general notion, though, has taken hold that there was a rushed judgment here, and that doesn't vindicate everybody in the Penn State administration. It does not mean that Joe Paterno cannot be criticized or that he is necessarily blameless. But when the free report came out and when the university accepted it without reservation, it was almost like, what can we do to flog ourselves in the public square to the greatest possible extent? And then when the NCAA issued its ruling within days of the free report, everyone was inclined to believe, it seemed only logical, well, the free report must be a cut-and-dry situation. It must be an across-the-board credible indictment, and it is what it is. And other than Penn State loyalists, everybody accepted that as case closed. And most of the news media has moved on. As you know, Kevin, it's like, hey, there's nothing here to see. We had our narrative. Iconic football coach, beloved not just for victories, but for a certain sense of rectitude, discovered to have feet of clay, enables a child molester. The university turns the wrong way or turns the other way, rather, And because football was king there, things were allowed to go on in the name of football rather than jeopardize the image of the football program that were horrific and deeply immoral. There's your narrative. It's a compelling narrative. Any novelist would love it. End of story, goodbye. Except sometimes the actual truth turns out to be more complicated than the first take. And I think what we can fairly say, we can't go through all the whys and wherefores of the Free Report and the Thornburg Report, which was put together to refute it. But I think it's very, very fair to say that reasonable people now no longer accept the first draft of history. They may accept it as it pertains to Jerry Sandusky and his crimes, but as it pertains to Joe Paterno especially and Penn State in general, I think the jury is still out, literally and figuratively. They haven't even impaneled the jury yet for the trials of Spaniard, Schultz, and Curley, and I think what's likely to come out in those trials will shed additional light, even though he's not around to defend himself. And it might be said, by the way, that every law enforcement official in Pennsylvania said that had he lived, there's no way in the world that Joe Paterno ever would have been charged. That's been said, and it shows up like in small type on page 18 of newspapers. But when these trials play out, I think it'll cast additional light, quite possibly, if not favorable, then at least softening the indictment of Joe Paterno.
And Bob,
I mean, the public indictment. There was never a real legal indictment, but I mean
right.
The indictment in the court of public opinion.
And Bob, based on my knowledge of these impending, and I use quotation marks around them, criminal trials of Spaniard, Schultz, and Curley, I don't believe, and I have a legal background, and I use that to say this, I don't believe any of those people will ever come to trial. I believe those cases will be dismissed before they ever come to trial for lack of evidence. And if that happens, I wonder if the national media, as you accurately described it, having moved on, will revisit that. I don't know if they will. In fact, to this date, the only national mainstream media person who has is you. I don't hold out much hope that they will.
Well, you may be right. On the one hand, if the charges are all dismissed, then it suggests something. In a way, those of us more interested in bearing down closer to the truth would prefer to see these things come to trial and prefer to have the evidence out there in public and all the arguments out there in public. You're right, though, about the national media. I have encouraged various outlets that are in a position to do it. For example, to me, an ESPN 30 for 30, looking back on this, is such a natural. Why wouldn't you do a 30 for 30? I can only wish that I was still at HBO. I'm very happy to be at the Baseball Network, but I had to give up HBO in order to go do my favorite sport, baseball, and to go to the Baseball Network. If I was at HBO, you can be sure that we'd be doing programs about this or extended segments about this, and I've tried to do it in the places where I've been able on NBC, but it's just the way television works that the Sandusky interview obviously resonated. It was something that got widespread attention. It was completely appropriate in its place, in its time. And then we followed up on it a week later with Brian Williams. And then everyone moved on. I'm not blaming anyone. That's just kind of the way it is. But that doesn't always serve the truth or fairness.
Yeah, it really doesn't. And in this case, I think that the NCAA's relaxing of these unmitigatedly unprecedented sanctions so quickly tells me something. And with the litigation that's going on in State College against Mark Emmert, against Penn State, against the NCAA, for Emmert to all of a sudden relax these unprecedented sanctions that he inflicted on Penn State tells me he wants nothing to do with the deposition. He wants nothing to do with going under oath, and I believe Louis Freeh wants nothing to do with going under oath. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, both were offered a chance to come on your show on MSNBC, and they declined.
That's right. That's right. We did in fact invite them, and they, for whatever reasons, declined. And people can infer whatever they want from the NCAA lessening the penalties, but your inference is not a crazy one, that's for sure.
Bob, let's talk about, we're going to move around a little bit here, but you're in Denver for Peyton Manning, and you talked already about the history that could be made Sunday night with regard to Brett Favre's number. Just a couple of years ago, Drew Brees broke John Unitas's long-standing number of 47 consecutive games with at least one touchdown pass, which I believe is one of the greatest records of all time, given the era in which Unitas played, given the rules under which Unitas played with regard to destroying receivers off the line of scrimmage. To me, Unitas's record, while it has been broken, is similar to Babe Ruth's being broken under the steroid era, yet I'm not saying that Drew Brees is on steroids, don't get me wrong, but a different game is being played today. It's almost pinball football.
Well, it is a different game. The rules are different. All the circumstances are different. Let me switch quickly back to baseball. The record, such as it is, for most strikeouts per 9 innings pitched, the top 4 guys, and maybe more than that, but the top 4 guys when I checked toward the end of the season, are all active players, and they're all relief pitchers. So does that mean that Aroldis Chapman or Craig Kimbrell, and they're plenty good, or Kenley Jansen, does that mean that they are better strikeout pitchers than Nolan Ryan or Sandy Koufax or Walter Johnson in the context of his time, when a guy would choke up on the bat and rather punch a ground ball to second base than strike out? You know, all of these marks are created under different circumstances and in different contexts, including Babe Ruth not playing against integrated competition and not traveling coast to coast, or whatever it may be. There are things that affect performances for the better and for the worse, and that has to be taken into account.
You mentioned earlier that your favorite game that you love to do is broadcast baseball, and you do it so well for the MLB Network. And those who haven't heard Bob on the MLB Network, I'm sorry for you. I wish you were doing these playoffs. I wish you were doing the World Series. I think you're the finest baseball broadcaster I've ever heard. And I've heard Harry Carey, Jack Buck. I've heard Joe Garagiola. I've heard Bob Starr. I've heard all the greats. I've heard Mel Allen. I've heard Vin Scully. And I tip my cap to you. This playoff series coming up, the World Series, these 2 playoff championship league series completed now, it's amazing what we've seen in baseball, that the Kansas City Royals can turn this game on its ear and I believe be the favorite coming into this World Series.
Well, it's the nature of baseball. I'm not saying that what the Royals did is likely, but it's just much more possible than a team that is significantly inferior on paper and none of the numbers add up, winning best 4 out of 7 in basketball, for example. It's very, very unlikely. Single game, yeah, that's what makes the NCAA tournament exciting. But 4 out of 7 when the matchups don't make sense. You know, the Orioles were a better team, and clearly a better team, over the course of the season than Kansas City. So, too, were the Angels. But they blew both of them away. They swept them both. It can just happen sometimes in baseball, and especially in a series like Baltimore-Kansas, where they win the first game in extra innings, they win the second game by scoring in the 9th when it had been tied, and then they win 2 home games both by the score of 2-1. And St. Louis, everyone's saying to themselves, you know what? We lost to the Giants in 5, could just as easily change a play or 2 in any game, have won the darn thing in 5. That's just kind of the nature of baseball.
And isn't it interesting, though, that the old maxim is good pitching beats good hitting all the time. And the Royals have proven that. The Angels were, in my opinion, a slow-pitch softball team once they lost their top pitcher to injury. They came in with a bunch of guys that could slug the heck out of you, but if you neutralize them with great pitching, look what happens. Orioles were very similar. They were a home run hitting team, had a good bullpen, but mediocre starting pitching. And the Royals used an aggressive approach on the bases, which I love, being a baseball purist. I love to see guys run. I love to see them put pressure on the defense because it's just human nature, Bob. If you and I are playing shortstop and a ground ball is hitting the hole, if I'm running, you take your time, read a book, throw me out. But if a guy's running that has speed, you're rushing, you might boot it, everything changes.
That's right. Well, Cardinal fans of a certain vintage remember what Whitey Herzog's teams of the 80s were like. Now, of course, the game was different then, and there were more artificial surface fields, and St. Louis was one of those artificial surface fields, so he built a team that was geared toward that. But it wasn't just the stolen bases, and there were plenty of them. It was the pressure they put on defenses. It was going from first to third. It was, as you say, causing guys to rush on plays. It was just constantly creating that sense that anything might happen at any moment. They were going to play aggressively. They were going to take chances. And then on top of that, they built a very good defensive team as well. And Kansas City has an exceptionally good defensive team. That's the only way they're going to win. It's the only way they've won to this point, and it's the only way they'll beat the Giants in the World Series. And then you have to have what can happen in baseball in a small sample. You have to have some things that kind of defy the law of averages. Here you have in Kansas City a team that hits the fewest home runs in all of the major leagues. You think about that, fewer than any National League team, even though they're in a DH league, the fewest in the major leagues. And yet they got some home run hitting in the postseason, at least to this point. So when you add that to the givens for them, the speed, the team defense, the tremendous bullpen, and then you got guys suddenly coming alive and hitting home runs, that's where you wind up winning 8 straight postseason games.
You know, back in 2004, the Red Sox rallied from a 3-0 deficit against the Yankees, finished them off with 4 straight, then swept the Cardinals in the World Series. And I remember you and I talking, and it always stuck with me because you said the Red Sox were on the destiny train. And it was a great phrase because I thought the next year the White Sox were on the very same train. Are the Royals on that train this year, do you think?
Well, you might say so, except there's certainly an aura around the Giants. They're trying to win their 3rd World Series in alternate years, 2010, 2012, 2014. They've got the essential cast of characters with Bochy and with Posey and Sandoval and some of the rest, the essential core group. There's a feeling around that team. You know, if you were to say if the Cardinals are not the model franchise from top to bottom organizationally and in all respects, then your next candidate would probably be the Giants. I mean, they're just a beautifully run team, beautifully managed by Bruce Bochy. So I'm not going to say that they're going to roll over. Now, obviously, neither did the Cardinals in 2004. They'd won more than 100 games. They had everything going for them, and the Red Sox just kept on going. So, you know, maybe I'm contradicting myself here. I go back to my original axiom, which is that in baseball, almost anything can happen in a short series. But I do not expect the Giants to roll into Kansas City and have the feeling that they're destined to lose.
Bob, as you cover the NFL every Sunday night on NBC and obviously throughout the week and getting your preparation done, this league looks more and more to me like a league of attrition. Whoever is left standing is usually going to win. The healthiest team survives. Not necessarily the best, but the healthiest, as it turns out, it seems, because of all the injuries on the field. I mean, you look at New England, a team that was left for dead but has a phenomenal game against Cincinnati, and then the very next week goes into a tough road game but loses 2 of their top players. You just look around the league, and it's a weekly occurrence. And then we have the concussion issues, and Marvin Lewis, I'm not sure if you saw his comments yesterday, but he said he doesn't understand. Yeah, he did. I mean, it's just uneducated from the top of the organization on down, and I'm wondering if anything's going to save this sport from extinction at some point, certainly not in the near future.
Well, what Marvin Lewis said, and Marvin Lewis is a very nice guy and a smart guy who said a really foolish thing. What he said about concussions and that it's sort of a media-created issue. No, it's a fundamental football issue that the football establishment itself and the media should have been all over a long time ago. So let's just dismiss that out of hand. And you're right about the season being a war of attrition. One of the reasons why, if you can get a first-round bye, that helps you. At least you can lick some of those wounds and get reasonably healthy for when you do begin playing again in the postseason. But you're right. This is the only sport. And I said this to people, and they sort of go, oh, yeah, but it's something you take for granted. This is the only sport where going into every game and coming out of every game, it is assumed that there will be an injury list. There are injuries in every sport. They're incidental to every sport. But injuries are fundamental to football. It would be unheard of if you came out of a football game with nobody on the injury list. When Mike Matheny sits down for his post-game press conference, the first question isn't who got hurt, or is everybody healthy? It's not expected that someone will be hurt in every basketball game, every baseball game, or even every hockey game. It's expected that you will have an injury list in football. And now we can expect, even by the league's own admission, that roughly 25 to 30%, maybe more, of all participants will by midlife have serious cognitive issues. They will suffer from some form of brain damage. That's not incidental. That's fundamental. That's what the sport is about. But to answer your, or at least it's part of what it's about. To answer your question, though, will it survive? It's an obsession. What may well happen is that you're going to have millions and millions of Americans who are like the spectators in the days of the Roman gladiators. They wouldn't want to do it themselves. They wouldn't want their kids to do it, but they're damn sure going to watch it. So you're going to have fewer and fewer parents allowing their children to play. Participation in youth football is already down some 10% over the last 3 years alone. But I don't see any massive movement based on television ratings and everything else of people saying, I'm not going to watch it anymore. They may feel some twinge of ambivalence when watching it, but 99% of them then say, what about my fantasy league? What about my team? What about my tailgating? What about my get-together with my buddies? And on they go.
Yeah, it's kind of like saying you don't want to vote for incumbents, but yet your guy's terrible, but I'll vote my guy back in. Football is...
Oh, yeah, right. Right, 8% approval rating for Congress, 92% re-election rate.
It's mind-boggling.
Here.
It's mind-boggling. It's a very similar concept. Yeah, but my fantasy league, I gotta follow that. So even though I hate it and my kids will never play, I'm going to keep watching. Hey, Roger Goodell, Bob, kind of stepped into a quagmire here with the Ray Rice deal too. So football's not doing itself any favors in PR. And I'm a guy that's always respected Roger Goodell. I think what he's done or tried to do for the safety of the players and safety of the game, while it may have been lawsuit created, is still a fundamentally good thing. And now all of a sudden, with the Ray Rice debacle, did he see the tape? Did he have knowledge of what happened? They hire a law firm that does business with the NFL and gets paid by the NFL. And while we all would love transparency, it's hard to buy into whatever conclusion this Robert Mueller, who was another former director of the FBI. I think we need to stop having former directors of the FBI commission reports, but it doesn't look good. There's a sour smell to it all to me.
Well, except the thing that works against that is that Mueller's reputation for integrity is to this point unshakable. Some of Freeh's reports in other situations have been questioned. I think Mueller's reputation in that regard has, to this point, been unquestioned. And my gut feeling, I can't prove this, we'll see what the investigation shows. My gut feeling is that Goodell did not see this tape. Should he have seen it? Absolutely. Should he have demanded to see it? Absolutely. Was the league's investigation of this incompetent and feckless? Absolutely. And they've more or less admitted all that. But knowing Roger Goodell as I do not think of him as someone who would knowingly, consciously tell a lie in a situation like that. And plus, there'd be no upside to telling a lie in that situation once the issue became a public issue.
Dude, what about the conversation with Ray Rice where he says now after seeing the video that Ray Rice misled him? There's obviously going to be a hearing on that because Rice and his camp have filed a grievance. It's going to be a he said, she said. And then it's going to come down to who do we all believe. Rice seemingly was the contritious kind of a guy. Oh, I did it. I'm taking every aspect of blame for it. It makes it hard for me to believe he didn't tell Roger Goodell that.
Well, we've had people say that Ray was completely forthright with Roger Goodell. This is one that's going to be more difficult to prove, as you said, in black and white in terms of this was exactly what was said, because it's going to come down to tone or some qualifying remark that may have been made. However, I don't know what one could have inferred other than that he cold-cocked her.
Right.
Once you saw the first video. The second video obviously is graphic, and it's what started the national debate, and some good can come out of it if the conversation continues and if the NFL actually takes steps not only to improve their protocols when it comes to domestic violence, but to become a national leader, some good can come out of it. So obviously that part didn't start until the second video was seen. But once we saw the first video, they're walking into the elevator. Maybe they're a little tipsy, but they're walking into the elevator. and now he's dragging her out. What the hell does anybody think happened in the elevator in a short period of time? So, you can't defend what the league decision was at that point. You as a lawyer might be better able to answer this than I, but it seems clear to me, and none of this is said to support or mitigate what Ray Rice did, which was obviously horrific. But I don't see how in the world he doesn't prevail when he petitions for reinstatement. I just don't. It's like the justice system had a shot at him, and they did whatever they did. It might have been much less than what they should have done, but they did whatever they did. Goodell had a chance. He did whatever he did. He himself said subsequently it was too lenient, but that was the verdict. I mean, is this guy subject to triple jeopardy, quadruple jeopardy? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
I couldn't agree more. I've said all along that whether you agree, and no one agrees with Ray Rice's conduct, obviously, in my book, the original video of him dragging his fiancée is as, to me, offensive as the graphic punch. This is the woman you claim to love, and you're dragging her like a dead cow. And so to me, that was so horrible that a 2-game suspension was laughable. But that's what was done. And so from a legal standpoint,
right,
if you try a case, which essentially they did, and you come up with a verdict, which essentially they did, you cannot go back on the verdict.
Right. And we know that the reason Ray Rice was suspended indefinitely was not so much because the NFL saw the tape. It was because the country saw the tape.
Right. Exactly. Bob, I know I don't want to keep you too long, but I love having you on, so I've kept you with all these topics. Pete Rose today says he fully expects that he'll be inducted into the Hall of Fame, though he might not live to see it. Bud Selig's comment, of course, is always the same. It's under advisement, which is sort of comical and a little bit asinine. Do you think at some point a new commissioner, in this case Rob Manfred, will eventually reopen that case, look at it, and give Pete Rose induction into the Hall of Fame, or at least pave the way for the writers to induct him?
I think the key phrase would be at some point. He's not going to do it right away because that would be viewed as a slap in the face at his predecessor, Bud Selig. But I think there may come a time when he feels like it makes sense. Enough time has passed. We can only have our fingers crossed that Pete is still with us when that happens. And then what they should do, as a matter of common sense, and this is technically in the hands of the directors of the board of the Hall of Fame, but obviously Manfred would have influence here. They should reset the clock. You can't say, well, his 15 years of eligibility have run out, which now is down to 10 because they rewrote the rule in the last year, but whatever it now is, that's run out because he was never on the ballot. You have to put him back on the ballot. If steroid guys are on the ballot, known steroid guys, put Pete Rose on the ballot, see what the voters say. That seems fair to me.
I couldn't agree more. Let the people who vote. And I'm always a believer that a guy has been punished enough for something like this. Yes, betting on baseball was egregious. There's no evidence he bet against his team, which would, in my opinion, be worse. But if this is what you have, he's now admitted it. He's been disgraced. Everyone is beyond that Pete Rose has been disgraced. I think we can all assume that Pete Rose is remorseful at this point, arrogantly though he may have denied it for so many years. Why not? I mean, wouldn't it be a nice celebration to see Pete Rose in the Hall of Fame?
I don't think there's a single baseball fan. Well, I take that back. There are very few baseball fans who would have any problem with justice being tempered by mercy here. He was banned from baseball. He remains banned from baseball. It's cost him millions of dollars in salary. It's cost him in endorsements, although he does occasionally have an endorsement in which now these days he's kind of poking fun at his own plight. But look what it's cost him. And no matter what he does, he's the all-time hit leader. He did what he did. In the first 2 paragraphs of this guy's obituary, it's going to be that he was banned from baseball. He's paid an enormous price. Nobody, if Pete Rose were reinstated for Hall of Fame consideration only, and if for the sake of argument he wound up in the Hall of Fame, would some kid in the year 2050 be walking through Cooperstown holding his dad's hand, read Pete Rose's plaque and then say, well, Dad, gee, I guess it's okay to bet on baseball because Pete's in the hall. What sense does that make? None. None. And then just ask yourself this question. And I realized that it was, the whole thing with steroids was murky when it shouldn't have been for a long time in baseball. And they did have that sign posted in every clubhouse for eons in baseball, betting on baseball, for or against your team, blah, 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 banishment. I get that distinction. But then ask yourself this question. Who damaged baseball more? Pete Rose, or fill in the name of whatever steroid guy you want. Who damaged baseball more? The answer is obvious.
Certainly
and you don't
is.
have to approve of anything that Pete did, either in betting on baseball or in lying about it or in associating with unsavory characters and all the stuff that Pete did that he shouldn't have done. Everybody gets that, okay? But how do you leave him out of the Hall of Fame? He did what he did. And he did what he did on the diamond. That's what matters.
That's what matters, and that's what should matter at this point. And I know there's political innuendo involved in this. Everybody was a Bart Giamatti fan, of course, as the commissioner, and he died tragically. And I know there are those who blame Pete Rose for that, which is, of course, insidious. But nonetheless, it happens. But the guy was a great player. He was to my way of thinking, Bob, he was a great ambassador for the game. I understand what he did was wrong, but he was a great ambassador for the game. And I think he belongs in the Hall of Fame. Hey, quickly before you go, Jameis Winston. Here's my statement on that. I believe these kids should be allowed to profit from their own autograph. Good grief, the NCAA profits from it. But if the rule says no, and they get caught, then we've got a quandary here. But this rule needs to be changed before too long. And yet in the meantime, I can't believe the knucklehead behavior of some of these guys.
I couldn't hear the last part you said, Kevin. I'm sorry.
I said I think the rule needs to be changed, but if the rule isn't changed, then, of course, they're guilty. But I can't, at the same time, I can't believe the knucklehead behavior of some of these college players as they're sitting on millions of dollars. And in this kid's case, one idiotic move after another has to hurt him eventually.
Well, correct. I mean, I don't know Jameis Winston. I'm told he's not an unintelligent kid, but he is obviously very immature and irresponsible and guilty of, and this may be putting it kindly, repeated poor judgment and perhaps even criminal behavior. So there's nothing to admire there, or very little to admire there, unless and until he straightens himself out. But I agree with you that rules about not being able to show up at some event where they might pay you $500 for opening a local car dealership or being able to profit from signing your name, that's nonsensical. Here's what the simple rules should be. It'll never be this way, but this is what the simple rules should be. No one gets into this university on an athletic scholarship who could not plausibly gain admission to this university if we had no basketball program, if we had no football program, or for that matter, if we had no swimming, volleyball, or lacrosse program. The person does not have to be a potential Rhodes Scholar. They just cannot get into this university, and their extracurricular ability, be it sports or the ability to play a cello, works to their advantage. And if they come from a disadvantaged background, we'll give them a break in that regard too. But still, they have to plausibly be able to meet the minimum standard of this university, what it would be if that athletic program didn't exist. Otherwise, they don't gain admission. Once that happens, they do not receive a salary. This idea of paying people to play college sports is just so cynical. It's waving the white flag. It's saying there is no value in education. But if there is a value in education, well, then you're getting hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of value if the education actually means something to you and if it isn't a sham. And if you don't want it, then go play minor league sports someplace. But don't use the university as a sham, and don't have the university be complicit in that. So the only thing that the kid should get is a stipend. The kid should get a stipend because practice time and everything else makes his circumstances, or her circumstances in some cases, different than the average college student. But they get a stipend, and the stipend for a Heisman Trophy winner is the same for the last guy on the bench. And you got to be a legitimate student, and we take it from there. If those two things were in place, And then you allow them, by the way, although they're not paid by the university, to your point, you allow them to benefit from autographs or auction items or whatever it may be. That seems fair. There's no way to police it in a consistent fashion anyway. That's common sense. Leave that in place, and everything will be more or less fine.
You know, I couldn't agree with that theory more. And yet, in order for that to happen, as you prefaced it by saying it probably will never happen, in order for it to happen, we have to have university presidents, athletic directors, chancellors who actually value the right things.
Yeah, and who many of them do value the right thing, but they're afraid to act unilaterally. You know, if University A decides that they're going to put in place reforms like that we just talked about, they're afraid that University B won't do that, and they'll lose on Saturday 52-0.
and the alumni will stop donating money.
Exactly.
Hey, Bob, great stuff, as always. Appreciate it. Have fun in Denver. It's going to be a fun game Sunday night with the Broncos and the 49ers. We always appreciate your time.
All right, Kevin. Thanks a lot. See ya.
Thanks, Bob. That's Bob Costas from NBC Sports and the MLB Network, the busiest sportscaster in the country. We're coming back in the Pabst Blue Ribbon Gateway Buick GMC Kings Court because, as always, we ran long.